Right.
All right. I'm turning to Matthew chapter 5 this morning, surprisingly enough. So this morning we're going to wrap up our series within a series. Our series is on the Sermon on the Mount. We've kind of been doing a mini-series inside that on sex and marriage over the last 4 weeks. So this is week 4 of that. If you'll remember a couple of weeks ago, just to kind of get you back where we were a couple of weeks ago, we're discussing marriage. I'm talking about what Jesus had to say about marriage in Matthew chapter 5, specifically as you get into verse 31. And we talked about the meaning of marriage a couple of weeks ago. We talked about, we went into Ephesians and talked about how it's ultimately a reflection of Christ and His church. And so that's why it's so important that our marriages do what the Bible tells them to do, and they're designed the way the Bible's designs them, and we live them out the way that God calls us to live them out. And so we get back into this passage in Matthew chapter 5 today. We're going to really kind of sit down for a moment on the issue of divorce. This is an uncomfortable topic. I hope y'all have realized over the last few weeks we just dig in on the uncomfortable topics, okay? I know that there are people in this room who've gone through divorces. I know there are people in this room who maybe your parents have gone through divorces. You've dealt with this issue, and I'm not here to beat anybody up over any of that today. That's not what we'll be doing today. But I do want to talk about this issue because the Bible talks about it. So let's begin with this question. What do you think the differences are between marriages that last and marriages that end in divorce?
Selfishness versus selflessness.
Okay, so a marriage that lasts is going to be one where, as we talked about a couple of weeks ago, where you're thinking about the other person more than you're thinking about yourself. Yeah, absolutely. Anybody else?
I have another one.
Okay, giddy up.
Compromise.
Yeah, okay, compromising, okay, yeah.
Having God at the center, like if you're marrying in a sense the Lord rather than the other person, then you're going to be faithful to the Lord, which means you'll be faithful to the person.
Yeah.
As opposed to not having God as that center.
Yeah, I'm going to be just really straight with y'all. I've seen this pattern repeat itself over and over during my time in the church. I see a couple who seems like everything's going great. They seem to have a good marriage. Then you notice they haven't been in church in a couple of weeks, and then a month. And no, sorry, I didn't. Y'all had a good excuse. And then a month, and then 2 months, and then 6 months. You realize you haven't seen them in a long time, and then a year later you hear that they got a divorce. It happens over and over and over again. If you don't keep that relationship with the Lord right, it's never going to. Your marriage is not going to be right, and inevitably that's what's going to happen, especially if you're a believer. So absolutely, all of that y'all are talking about. Anybody else? Anybody want to add anything to that about the differences between marriages that last and those that end in divorce? Y'all feel like none of you have enough experience to speak on the topic yet? Either zero experience or not much experience. Here's the bottom line. The difference between a marriage that lasts and a marriage that ends in a divorce is that the marriage that lasts, the couple just stays together. I mean, more than anything else, the most important thing you can do as a couple is just stay together. If you don't want to get a divorce, don't get a divorce, okay? It's really that simple. Just you're committed to it. Crystal is out of town this morning, but she would tell you that we've committed to choose murder over divorce, jokingly. But we'll consider that before we consider divorce. It's just there've been some we've had some times in our marriage that were really hard and really difficult and could have ended the marriage, but we just chose not to, and we're going to continue to do that. And that's the bottom line. That's the difference between a marriage that lasts and doesn't last. And so this issue of divorce is an incredibly controversial topic. There's lots of disagreement over it in the culture, but there's also a lot of disagreement over it in the church, okay? And unfortunately, this is an issue that we have found the church is becoming more like the world that we're not as committed to marriage as we used to be. We've lost a lot, and honestly, we've lost a lot of moral authority in the church, talking about things like marriage, same-sex marriage, and those kinds of things, because we've not lived out marriage the way it's supposed to be lived out in the first place. So we've lost moral authority over that. So we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, that God has designed marriage to be a permanent, lifelong commitment between a man and a woman. And when that is distorted, we're in essence telling lies about God, because God has designed marriage not only to be that commitment, but to be that commitment as a reflection of the relationship between Christ and His church. So it's a picture of the gospel. And so when we don't live out our marriages the way we're supposed to live them out, then we are basically telling lies about God. That's what the Bible is telling us, okay? And so one of the most important things that we can understand is this. So your salvation, if marriage is a picture of the gospel, how do you lose your salvation? You can't. And so if we're going to reflect the gospel in our marriages, what does that say about the permanence of those marriages? If Jesus isn't going to walk away from me, what should I do with my spouse? Not walk away from them, okay? And so that's the issue that I want us to see today, okay? Now, I mentioned this, but it bears repeating. I mentioned it a couple of weeks ago. Marriage is the shadow. The gospel is the real thing, okay? So marriage is a reflection of the gospel. And because it's a reflection of the gospel, it's never going to be a perfect representation of the gospel. And that means that husbands, you're supposed to be the Jesus in your marriage, but guess what? You ain't Jesus, okay? You're never going to be Jesus. So you're going to be an imperfect representation of Jesus, and therefore our marriages are going to be imperfect representations of the gospel. And because that's true, there are some circumstances that marriages are broken beyond repair. And so in those circumstances, the Bible has given some permissions about when divorce is allowed to happen. And so I want us to see that, but I want us to see, as we're talking about those permissions, I want us to understand what the Bible is saying about marriage. It is intended to be permanent. It is intended to be a lifelong commitment. Every marriage is hard. Even the best marriages are hard. Okay? You're going to go through really hard times, even in good marriages. They require work, but we offer grace to one another, and we do that because that's what Jesus did for us. Okay? So let's do this. Let's look at Matthew chapter 5, verses 31 and 32 again, and let's talk about what it is saying as it's related to the issue of divorce. Somebody read that for me.
It was also said, whoever divorces his wife must give her a written notice of divorce. But I tell you, everyone who divorces his wife, except in the case of sexual immorality, causes her to commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Okay, so first of all, remember the background here in the Sermon on the Mount. So this is one of 6 what are called antitheses that we find in the Sermon on the Mount. And in each of those antitheses, Jesus says something like, you have heard, it has been said, or in this case, it was also said. And then he repeats something either that we find in the Old Testament or we simply find in tradition that the people are talking about in that time. And so in this case, we see him say, you've heard it said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. Now, we find this in the Old Testament. This is something that Moses was given by God to allow a permission for divorce, okay? So it was allowed in the Old Testament with a stipulation. It says if a man was going to divorce his wife for some reason, he needed to do something. What is that?
Give her a certificate.
Give her a certificate. Now, that may sound like really simple to y'all, but actually in these cultures, in the culture that day, and in some cultures today even, if a man wants to divorce his wife, all he has to do is say, I'm divorcing you, get out of here, okay? And what would that do to a woman in that situation?
Leave her without.
Yeah, it would leave her in a very vulnerable situation. Everybody knows she's married, and she doesn't have anything official saying that she's divorced, so she can't really get remarried. And in that culture that day, what would a woman who couldn't be married, how would she survive?
Prostitution?
Possibly.
Strong
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the few options that she would have in that situation. Or if you go back and if y'all remember the story about Jesus and the woman in the well, the Samaritan woman at the well, she was living with the man. So doing something like that, finding and a guy who's going to live with you is probably not, got your best interest at heart. So what Moses is doing right here with this idea of a certificate of divorce is actually a step forward for women. Okay, because with a certificate, they're allowed to go get remarried. They're allowed to find support. So this was a protection for the wife, all right? And so there was this great debate, though, in Jesus' time, because we like to debate these things today too, about exactly what this meant. So Moses said if he finds some indecency in her, that he could write her an issue of divorce. And there were kind of two schools of thought. We mentioned this a couple of weeks ago. One was that basically that indecency means anything. I can write my wife a certificate of divorce if she burns my dinner. And so that was one school of thought. And the other school of thought was, no, this is under the most extreme circumstances, something like sexual immorality or something like that. And so when we read this passage, whose side does Jesus seem to be taking here? The first or the second? The first view, which is you can divorce for any reason, or the second view, which he's siding with this second view here, okay? But he's actually saying a lot more than that, okay? And so here's what he says. He says, you've heard this thing about divorce, but I want to tell you something else. A man who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality makes her do what?
Commit adultery.
Yeah. How is that? What do you think he means by that?
That marriage is supposed to be permanent forever, so as soon as she leaves and goes somewhere else after divorce, whoever she marries next ultimately is going back on that covenant between you, God, and the spouse.
That's it. So what I want you to understand here is that he's not blaming the wife here. He's telling the husband, this is what you're doing to your wife if you send her out like this ultimately, okay? I mean, the only choice that a woman in this situation would have would be to get remarried. Okay, and he's saying that what you're doing is putting her in that kind of situation. Remember what we said a couple of weeks ago. The point of marriage is to be permanent. And when you treat it cavalierly, you're not just making the marriage invalid. There's still vows that were made before God, and so he expects you to keep those vows. So a man who casts his wife off puts her in a position of either not being able to survive or committing adultery by finding another husband. And even more than that, the second husband, who is in a very real sense seeking to help the woman who needs this support, is in the position of committing adultery himself by taking a wife who's already bound to someone else. And so here's the question, though. Who is he blaming for this situation right here? Who? Yeah, the man who leaves his wife. Okay, that's what he's really pointing to right here. Okay, he's not beating up the woman. He's not even really beating up the man who marries this woman who's been divorced. He's talking to husbands right here. He is saying that if you leave your wife for except for this one reason that I have right here, you are putting this woman in a position of being of this awful position is what he's saying, okay? So hold on to that idea, and I know what you're reading right here when it comes to the issue of divorce, especially as it's related to how we talk about it in our culture and even in our church today and how we look at it. Like this is radical stuff, okay? So hold on to it and don't freak out yet, okay? If you're still freaking out at the end of the class, come talk to me, okay? But don't freak out yet as you read this, because I want you to feel the radical nature of what's being said right here, okay? Because this is serious stuff that Jesus is saying here. But it does seem clear from this passage that Jesus is saying something important about the proper grounds for divorce. He does grant some kind of exception. What does he say that exception is?
Sexual immorality.
Sexual immorality, okay? So he's saying in cases of adultery, that person has a grounds for divorce. If your spouse cheats on you, you get a divorce, there's nothing wrong with that. When a divorce happens for the right reasons, then remarriage becomes an option, is what he's saying also. That's the whole point of the certificate of divorce in the Old Testament, so that the woman could get remarried, so that the husband would get remarried. That was the whole point. So he's saying when that happens, remarriage is not only possible, but it's fine. Now hold on to that idea. I want to get back to it, but I want to pull in one more passage here to get a total biblical picture about divorce, and then I want to we're still going to have some strands that we're going to have to pull at for a minute to fully understand what the Bible is saying about that here, okay? So somebody go to 1 Corinthians chapter 7 for me real quick. When you get there, somebody read verses 10 through 16 for me.
To the married I give this charge, not I, but the Lord. The wife should not separate from her husband. But if she does, she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and the husband should not divorce his wife. To the rest I say, I, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever, and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. God has called you to peace. For how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife?
Okay, so this passage is a discussion about marriage in general, and Paul uses it also to talk about divorce. I want you to see several things here. If you look at verses 1 through 9, it talks about the benefits of singleness. Now, the Bible says it's not good for a man to be alone, that it's a good desire to want to be married. But we have to weigh that against what Paul says here about singleness. He says there are some distinct advantages to being single, though it's obviously not a command to be single. If you're single right now, God is telling you that there are some advantages there. He says you don't have to worry about a spouse. You can just you can worry about the Lord, okay? And if you're married, you understand what he's saying there, okay? All right? We have stuff we have to deal with our spouses that we did when we're single. But in verses 10, so I want you to understand that first of all when he talks about the idea of remaining single if you've been divorced. Second thing though, in verses 10 through 16, he lays out these general ideas about marriage, and then he offers some particulars about divorce, okay? Verses 10 and 11, what does Paul say to husbands and wives about divorce?
You should not separate.
Yeah, he said, don't do it. Don't divorce your wives. Don't leave your husbands. And then he adds something for wives. There may be some time that it might be proper for a wife to leave her husband. We'll talk about that in a minute. And even in these cases that aren't covered by divorce exceptions. But when that happens, what does he say that they should do?
Remain unmarried.
Yeah, remain unmarried. Paul's already talked about the benefits of being single here, okay? And he says right here that if there is a circumstance that is not covered by the exceptions that we're talking about, and you have to leave your spouse, then you should remain single, okay? Now, verses 12 through 14. What does Paul say about divorce in this situation in verses 12 through 14? He's talking about a situation where a husband or a wife is an unbeliever and they leave their spouse. Well, first of all, before he does that, he says if they're not a believer, should you leave them?
No,
No, it says don't leave them. And why does he say that?
not if they're willing to live in peace.
Yeah, if they're willing to live in peace, don't. And what's his point? Why does he want them to stay with that unbelieving spouse?
Be sanctified through that relationship.
Yeah, that you could see them come to Christ through it. Your children can see the picture of the gospel here. So under what circumstances would a husband or a wife find themselves married to an unbeliever? Should you, if you were single, marry an unbeliever? Let me answer that question first of all. The Bible's really clear. We shouldn't be unequally yoked. But there are some circumstances where someone might find themselves married to an unbeliever. What would they be?
You're not a believer when you got married.
Yeah, you got saved after you got married. That's probably what happened with all of the people Paul is talking about right here. They came to Christ after they got married. Or maybe you thought they were a believer when you got married and they walk away from the faith or something like that. You see that happen, okay? Or maybe you did wrong and you married somebody you shouldn't have married in the first place. But there are circumstances where you would find yourself married to an unbeliever, and Paul says that you should stay married to that person as long as they're willing to be married for the sake of them. You could see by living out the Christ life in front of them, they could turn to Christ. That's not an endorsement of missionary dating or anything like that, but it could happen if you became a believer. They would too, and also for your kids. Okay, now here's the next thing, verses 15 and 16. What does Paul say about divorce there? If you're married to an unbeliever, and that unbeliever does what? Yeah, if the unbeliever leaves, what is your responsibility in that situation?
Just let it.
Yeah, let it go. And he uses a specific word. He says you're not what? Bound. What do you think he means by that?
You're not bound to that covenant.
Yeah. I mean, they've walked away from it. You're not bound to it. You are divorced. And so you're free to get remarried, okay? So though staying could bring repentance, you don't know that's going to happen. And that's what he says. How do you know, wife, whether you're going to save your husband? And how do you know, husband, whether you're going to save your wife? So if they leave, you are free is basically what he's saying. Now, I would interpret this fairly broadly. I'm going to be honest with you. I would say that a spouse who just brazenly leaves their husband or their wife, whether they profess to be a Christian or not, they just say, I'm leaving for no reason, is really in some sense walking away from Jesus and showing themselves to possibly not be a believer, okay? So I would interpret that pretty broadly and say that if you as a husband or a wife have been abandoned by your spouse, that you were free to be remarried. Okay, so that's what I would say. Now, let's put all this together and understand what I believe the biblical argument about exceptions of when marriage can end are. And these are not, I'm not telling you this so you can write these down just in case, okay? That's not what I'm getting at here, okay? These are all permissions, not rules. If your spouse cheats on you, you are not required to divorce them. Okay? As a matter of fact, under most circumstances, I would hope there was that reconciliation and forgiveness would be sought, and you could put the marriage back together. Okay? But these are the exceptions. Jesus says that a marriage can end in divorce in the case of adultery. Paul says a marriage can end in divorce in the case of an unbeliever abandoning a believer. And when a marriage ends in divorce, for one of those two reasons, the believer is free to remarry. When it ends for reasons other than that, though, what does the Bible seem to be saying?
Don't remarry.
You don't need to get remarried, okay? Jesus is saying that it's tantamount to committing adultery. Now, this opens up what I think are a lot of questions, okay? And so I want to try to deal with these, and if you have any other questions, we'll deal with those first, okay? First question, to me, the first question that jumps into my mind is, what about abuse? In a case of an abusive spouse, specifically an abusive husband, a wife stays in that marriage, or should they leave? What should they do in a situation like that? Okay, I'm not going to let this linger. If your husband is beating you, get out now. I'm sure that's not happening in any of these relationships. I sure hope it's not. If you're watching online, if you are in an abusive relationship, leave. Okay?
Got nudged by my wife.
Are you telling him he needs to go? Is that what you're saying? I just want to make that really clear, though, because those things do not end well. Almost always, they do not end well, okay? Now, most of the time in abusive relationships, we're going to see a situation where adultery is involved too, and if it's not immediately, it will be eventually. And so a person in an abusive relationship was probably free to remarry at some point. But one of the best things you can do is just, first of all, get away and not be looking to remarry immediately, to take some time, to be safe, find the help you need, use the church, use resources like Care Lodge, but get out, okay? And so that's the first thing I would say. And here's the next question that jumps to my mind, and maybe there's some others. What about if you have already been remarried, but you weren't divorced biblically in the first place? What does that mean for you? Should you split up?
Like if you haven't biblically been divorced for those two circumstances, but you've legally been divorced, like through the.
And then you get remarried. Is that?
Say you need to split up, but this, you know.
Yeah, because what does the Bible tell us about marriage?
Add to the statute, yeah.
Yeah. The Bible tells us that marriage is meant to be permanent, okay? And so if you were married, you are married, and God intends for you to stay married to that person, okay? And so despite now there may need to be some recognition that we didn't do this the right way, and we've got to do better here on out, and some repentance. But if you're married, the intention is for you to stay married. Go back to that story about the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman at the well. Do y'all remember what Jesus said? Go and get your husband. Y'all remember this story? And the woman said, I don't have a husband. And what did Jesus say to her? Y'all all mumbling. Y'all don't have to speak up.
I just said I couldn't remember.
Okay, well you were fine to mumble. Does anybody remember what Jesus told her after she said, I don't have a husband?
Something
You're
about
right,
drinking from
you
the
have
cup.
many, or something.
Yeah, said you're right to say you don't have a husband. You've had 5 husbands, and the person you're living with right now is not your husband. But you notice what he didn't say there. He didn't say you've had 1 husband, 4 people you weren't really married to, and then the guy you're not married to now you're married to. He recognized all those other marriages as valid marriages, okay? And so I just want to make that clear. Like, we don't need a wholesale thing of people who have been divorced and remarried, like getting divorced again. That's much worse, okay? So I just want to make that really, really clear there, okay? Next, what about divorce before a person becomes a Christian? In that situation, you become a believer, should you be going to find your old spouse? I mean, I'm not saying you shouldn't, but is it necessary, I guess is the question. No, when we become Christians, we are new creations, and so I think a person who went through even an unbiblical divorce before their conversion, probably free to get remarried, okay? But in all of these circumstances, I want to be clear, we have ventured far from what I'm 100% sure on. Okay, these are what I think the Bible is telling us, okay? Now, final questions that I have, and then we can open it up to other questions. Just want to be clear on this. In any of these circumstances where God says you can get divorced, is it a requirement that you get divorced? No. We ought to be doing everything we can to keep our marriages together. Okay, and so we're not looking for, like, when you stand up before God and before your family and before the preacher and get married, you don't say till death do us part unless you do the following things. Okay, husbands and wives, you need to be prepared before you're married, but even when you're married, to say what is worst case scenario here? What's the worst thing they could do to me, and how can I forgive that? Because probably you're going to be hurt in a way that you can't imagine right now by your spouse at some point, in a way that you think they'd never do it to you, in a way that hurts worse than anything you could ever imagine, because you have this one flesh relationship with one another. And it may not be anything as bad as what you imagined would hurt so bad, but you're going to be really hurt by your spouse. There's going to be a time in your relationship that you're going to be tempted to walk away. Going to be many times. And if you're thinking about the exceptions now, when the time comes, you'll take one. Okay? So that's what I want you to understand today, okay? All right. Is there any issue is related to this that y'all don't think I've covered that you have questions about?
I don't know what people's thoughts are on like Francis Chan, or if people even know who that is.
Sure.
But you know, I've even heard him do teachings on like that sexual immorality piece, and like he even went deeper into there, like with the intent of not getting the divorce. Like if it's something that happens and, you know, a one-time deal when there was repentance and stuff, like even he was preaching about how that's even, you still, for somewhat reason, need to stay in that marriage. It's like a repeated, like this person's not gonna change, they're gonna continue to cheat on you type of deal. Just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I would interpret this very broadly to cover a whole lot of sexual immorality, but at the same time, I would say that every Christian ought to be willing to forgive the worst because God has forgiven the worst in us. Okay? So always remembering that if marriage is a reflection of the gospel, man, I'm gonna tell y'all, God's forgiven y'all of some real bad stuff. And I know that because I know He's forgiven me of some real bad stuff. And so we ought to be seeking, that should always be the first thought. Reconciliation, forgiveness. How do we put this back together instead of how can I get out? Okay? Here's the most important question when it comes to this issue. There is going to come a time in your marriage, if it is not already here, that you are going to be unhappy in your marriage. There are going to come multiple times in your marriage that you are going to be unhappy in that marriage. And the question you may have is this: why would God want me to remain in an unhappy marriage? Okay, and how would you answer that question? You need to have an answer to this question in your mind right now, whether you're married or not married. Why would God want me to remain in an unhappy marriage? What is the answer to that?
I don't know if this is right or anything, but it just came like he didn't call us to be happy, like he called us to be committed to each other.
Okay, yeah.
I don't know.
The commitment that we have is more important than our happiness. I think that's absolutely part of it, no doubt. Anybody else?
I think sometimes when people claim that they're unhappy in a marriage, it's due to a quick reaction maybe, or a outside interference. That seems to be a big, you can do better, leave it, why do you deal with that? And you start telling yourself, I'm unhappy.
Yeah, absolutely. So outside interference is a big one. Guys, don't listen to your non-believing friends tell you stuff about marriage and that it's better on the other side. Okay? Don't listen to that. Don't listen to your friends who claim to be believers who tell you that it's better on the other side, okay? Stay away from that kind of stuff because it will end in trouble.
How'd you word the question again?
Why should I stay in an unhappy marriage?
Oh, yeah. I just think too, like the purpose of a marriage too, is also to give testimony to who God is, who Jesus is, you know, and what that relationship is supposed to look like.
Yeah, absolutely. I want you to understand this. Go back to the very beginning of chapter 5. Do you remember the Beatitudes? Every Beatitude started with the word. What was it?
Blessed.
Blessed. And that we talked about what that word meant. Do y'all remember what we said?
Happy.
Happy. Okay? God has already told you where real happiness is. Where in those Beatitudes does God say, does Jesus say, happy are those in great marriages? He doesn't. He's told you where real happiness is found, and it's found there. It's found through life in His kingdom, and He has told you that life in His kingdom includes husbands and wives who keep their covenant, who keep the covenant with one another, who keep the covenant with God, who no matter what say, we're going to stick together, we're going to stick this out, we're going to reflect the gospel in our marriage, and there may be times when doing that doesn't feel very good, okay? It hurts, and it's painful, and it's not fun, and I'm not happy. But what God is saying is that you are a broken person who does not understand where real happiness comes from. And whether you're married or not married, you're going to have times when you are unhappy in that sense. But if you will live out what he is telling you to live out, this kingdom life that he's talking about throughout the Sermon on the Mount, that's where real, lasting, eternal joy and happiness comes from, okay? And here's the other thing. I've been married for almost 20 years now, and Crystal could testify to this if she was here this morning. We've had some times where we're really unhappy with each other for significant lengths of time, okay? Just straight, all right? We weren't happy in our marriage, but you know what? Every one of them ended, the unhappy times, and we got back to being happy with each other. And so you can be unhappy and leave your marriage, and guess what? You're going to continue to be unhappy, more than likely, okay? Or you can stick in your marriage and just keep going through it. Stick with your spouse because Jesus stuck with you, and then find that by following Jesus, I'm going to find my greatest joy. And if your marriage remains unhappy for the rest of your life, guess what? You still have all of eternity to be filled with all the happiness that you can imagine, okay? So you keep living the way God has told you to live out that marriage, the way we talked about in Ephesians 5. More than likely, what you're going to find, it is going to lead to some of the greatest joys that you've ever imagined on this side of heaven, okay? There are going to be times when it's not going to be fun at all. But when we stick with it, that's when we discover what God has for us, and we discover our greatest joy and happiness, okay? All right, so what I want you to hear is that everything we've talked about, I don't want you to think that you've gotten some loopholes for getting out of your marriage today, okay? That's not what's going on here. I want you to understand what the Bible has to say about the issue, where it gives allowances, where it tells you need to do the work. But when we treat our marriages cavalierly in our society, Christians have to be different. Okay, we have to be different. This is a great opportunity. Our marriages are a wonderful opportunity to show the world that we are different, and to show the world truth about who God is. Okay, and so let's do what God is calling us to, what Jesus is calling us to through this sermon this morning, as it reflects the gospel. Okay, anybody want to add anything else? If I've said something that offended you this morning, please come to me afterwards and let's work it out, okay? These are hard teachings, all right? And I'm not perfect. So I might have said something wrong. So if you call me out on it, my response may be you're right, okay? But I'm trying as best I can to show you what the Bible is saying here about marriage, so you will take your marriages as seriously as God does, okay? All right. Anybody else? All right, let's go to close in prayer. Rob, you can close us?
Dear Lord, thank you for this day. Thank you for allowing us to come to your house, hear your word. Lord, just pray that we take this message, Lord, we apply it to our lives, Lord, we apply it to our marriages, and to our relationships, and to our friends that are dealing with this subject. Lord, just help us to be a light in a dark world. Lord, just pray for everyone that's not here, everybody that's sick, bring them back next week. We're going to pray. Amen.
Amen. Amen. All right, we have announcements that y'all know of this morning.